So we're in the final segment, which is sort of final thoughts and questions from the audience. Some of them left over from earlier sessions, and one of them kind of reaches back to the first session. We were talking about Theodore Herzl. Claire Panetta asks, "I wonder if anyone could speak to how Herzl's work was originally received. Was there resistance from within the European Jewish community to his ideas? Were there counter narratives?" Challenges to his propositions.
Um, Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's
one. Yeah, okay. This is a great question. So sadly, we didn't get to read all of that material. I do think Mark uploaded the whole book of the early writings on Zionists called The Zionist Idea. Correct, Mark?
Oh, no, just I uploaded Herzl's
I'll upload
piece.
it. That's
Okay,
fine.
yeah.
I can upload it if you want to read some of the others, because they are a lot. There is a wide range. Right. And I tried to mention this at the beginning, because of time constraints, it just did Herzl and Jabotinsky. And actually, we didn't even do the most aggressive Jabotinsky piece. He can really be a character. But to answer this question, was there resistance? Yes, very much. So at the beginning, Zionism had very little support in the Jewish world, particularly in the European Jewish world, for basically these reasons that some of which we talked about before, but I'm happy to reiterate now. Many Eastern European Jews who were either what's called mithnagdim, or which is sort of standard Orthodox, observant, or were Hasidim, right, sort of mystical Orthodox, really rejected this on religious grounds. You'll still see this to this day in parts all over the world. So very famously, there's very famous visible groups like what's it called, Neturei, I forget their exact name, who really make a scene of it. But actually, the Satmar, who are the largest Hasidic group, I think, in the world, are actually explicitly anti-Zionist. Some people might have seen videos of ultra-Orthodox Jews being beaten by Israeli police recently. This is because they were, in those neighborhoods, they openly fly Palestinian flags. They're against the state on religious grounds, and they view, these are not, talking about realpolitik and geopolitics, these are not ideal coalition partners or something like this, but they are, in fact, people who very strongly feel, for their own theological reasons, that like the Palestinian cause is just, and sort of what is being rained on Israel is God's wrath. Now, that's not a framing that I personally love, but it is theirs. Amongst more secular and integrated Jews, as we mentioned, that's more class. So the poorer Jews in Europe were mostly drawn either to communism or other forms of socialism, or Bundism, which was a kind of diasporic cultural Jewish socialism. And then finally, amongst like Herzl's own sort of universe, right? Liberal, sorry, not liberal, what's the word? Capitalist, honestly, bourgeois, like respectable, integrated, not particularly religious folks were mostly assimilationist or liberals. So Zionism actually had a pretty rough time of it at the beginning, and it really, really needed the backing of Christian Zionists and of the British Empire as it got. And I would say that lasts to this day. Again, we don't know what in Israel that isn't supported either by the United States or before that, the French, et cetera, looks like. So yeah, I hope that answers that question.
We have another question dealing with Hamas. Jason asks, "I'm wondering about the fascistic tendencies within Hamas's rhetoric.
Yeah.
Question if the fascistic tendencies underlying liberal regimes also exist in Palestine and in Israel. Or do you see Hamas's actions as merely political resistance, despite their anti-Jewish not simply anti-Zionist pronouncements and actions. So I guess there's a question here about kind of Hamas's like as a political formation, and kind of the
Sure.
meaning of their rhetoric.
It also feels like I should take it, but I don't want to step on anyone's toes. Anyone else want to address this before? I'm just giving sort of a boring historical answer. I'll give that first and then throw in comments for anyone else. The boring historical answer is, I think a lot of people know this. If you want from today's readings, read the last bit of the Khalidi, or the last bit of Farsoon. Again, these are the Khalidi is almost up to date. The Farsoon is from like 97, but they talk about the rise of Hamas. Now, Hamas was originally a branch of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood, who actually, even though today we often think of them as very much a political movement, they are actually at their birth a very quiescent movement. They really didn't get, they were like a revivalist movement, I guess that's the way you would put it. Very much focused on getting people as individuals and as families to sort of, become more pious Muslims. And in fact, the United States and Israel, in fact, deeply ironic, really saw religious movements, in particular, sorry, I'm usually much more careful about my use of the term religion, saw Islamic movements, in particular, or Islamist movements, as a kind of like safer and easier to deal with alternative to communism, to secular nationalism, and even to boring liberal republicanism, which you used to see represented across the Palestinian political spectrum. And in fact, if you're talking about Palestinians worldwide, is still very much the sort of, there's a mass spectrum. Now, Hamas, when it becomes more oriented towards when it became more oriented towards national liberation in Palestine, it actually had to break with the Muslim Brotherhood to a certain degree. And the Hamas of the 1980s, 1990s is not the Hamas of today. You can probably actually see this in the news, right? If you listen to the military branch, they're like spouting fire. And if you listen to the political branch, who are based in Qatar, they're like, yeah, we're still for the two-state solution, which is very funny. To me, like, I am a one-stater. I think that's the only possible end game, because in fact, I say this from the point of view of someone who thinks that it would be a tragedy if Palestine became like free of Jews, if Jews had to leave Palestine. I think that a sovereign free Palestine, a boring, non-utopian one, would be one for Palestinian and Jewish or Israeli, however they wanted to define themselves, coexistence. That said, a lot of groups that lined up behind Hamas, first, sorry, how should I say this? The Hamas was elected, as people know, probably in the 2005, 2006 elections, I think it was. A lot of their voting base are not like Islamists. They don't want, Sharia law and things like this. In fact, many Christian Palestinians voted for Hamas. Why? Because they were seen as less corrupt. And like the Muslim Brotherhood broadly in the Middle East, they provided social services where the state did not. And this built a lot of legitimacy. Also, as they became the only game in town, particularly in Gaza, a lot of non-Islamists joined Hamas, which is very strange. Tarek Bakoni, I think Illyria was referring to earlier, and I'll hand it to you if you want to talk about that, has written about this kind of stuff at length. But the kind of completely almost like eliminationist rhetoric that one would find in like early Hamas documents are now, at least in the official documents, exactly what I said from political leadership. Often it is, in fact, like, yeah, sure, we'll take a deal. Now, you can say that you don't believe that, or that is like two-faced or something like that. But I think it actually just reflects that not just the base of the party, and the movement or whatever it is, but that its structure has been stretched. It also, I think, is important to note that Hamas is not the only voice, but also I am not totally comfortable like policing other people's expressions of anti-colonial politics. I know that's not something people, I think, want to hear. If Hamas became like sovereign and was pursuing a fascistic eliminationist policy, that would be tragedy to me. And I don't think that is likely right now. And in fact, just even hearing myself to answer that question, I'm thinking we're actually watching a real genocide happening as opposed to an imaginary one that is not happening. So that's where I'll stop there. Illyria, did you want to add anything on this?
Yeah, I'll jump in on 2 points. One is related to what you've just said, but I'll leave that for a bit because it's me actually saying something. I haven't read the Bocconi myself, but Members School is going to be leading on Sunday a reading group on Hamas Contained, and folks could reach out to me on Facebook or on Twitter, Illyria Karina, and I will send details if you'd like to participate. But I did want to speak to this conception of anti-Jewish sentiment in Palestine, because it's something that gets rehashed a lot on social media. And what it is trying to call upon discursively is anti-Semitism in the West, and histories of anti-Semitism that have led to exterminationist events, to pogroms, and of course to the Holocaust.
Yes.
But the anti-Jewish sentiment of a 18-year-old who has spent the past 16 years of their life having everyone they love killed by a state who claims it is acting on behalf of Jews worldwide is not the same phenomenon. And we can quibble about what it actually is. And certainly in terms of the realpolitik of it, it's not useful that it exists, but it is not the same phenomenon. And it doesn't guarantee the same kinds of things as it would if it was showing up unannounced, as it does in the United States in neo-Nazi communities, right? There's a very different thing that is happening and that is being pulled upon so as to pick on people's genuine fears, but that doesn't really feel like it is reflected in any way in the material politics in Palestine.
If I could just add one thing to that, Gabe Winnett had a wonderful piece in Dissent, of all places, not usually a good venue for this issue in particular, talking about the way in which Israel sort of weaponizes this fear, this anxiety that it itself generates, right? Or that it takes advantage of amongst diasporic Jews. At the same time as it literally hates, I'm, I guess, the only Jew here now, but it hates us. Like if you are a Jewish person watching this and you lead a happy life here in the United States or in Europe, this is a Zionist's worst nightmare. This is Bibi Netanyahu in particular. This is worst nightmare. Why? Because it undermines the very case for Zionism, that you are happy and doing well. Or even that you're ordinarily miserable, like that you're miserable just like everyone else. That is, in fact, terrifying to the sort of ideological structure of Zionism, because it feeds on our fear and our anxiety. And it unfortunately means that quite a lot of our expression of genuine concerns, as Illyria just pointed out, gets weaponized, and is sort of, and this is not like an accident. It's not some weird affect theory like, I like affect theory, but it's not like some weird affect theory thing. It is like a machine for processing grief, fear, and anxiety, and turning it into jingoism and hate. And I'm also not someone who always runs away from hate. Sometimes you gotta hate some things. I hate class society, like a lot of things I hate. But I do think that that's very important. And also that, I'm gonna leave it as that. Anyone else want to say anything about Hamas and Hamas's internal political structure, its history, or development? Okay, let's move on then.
Another question from Jason. Is it possible that a policy goal of self-defense can veer into ethnic cleansing / genocide without policymakers necessarily being aware of it, or suppose are consciously intending to do it?
Yeah.
Where is the line between defense and offense, between a targeted military response and war crimes / ethnic cleansing? What role does intent play in genocide? Seemingly, one side, Hamas, has expressed genocidal intent, while another, the Israeli government, has actually had success in prosecuting a genocide.
Audrey, I feel like as our IR scholar, this is right up your alley, man. Oh, did I put you on the spot? I'm so sorry.
And the whole like defense and offense vocabulary that's being deployed in at least from my perspective to like defend Israel or to mollify any criticism of Israel, it's really dicey to use when you have such completely such an uneven situation, right? It's not like you have two armies facing off in a battlefield and you can like talk strategy as if those things were comparable. Can you talk about Israel defending itself when it, by all accounts, is the absolutely dominating force that just that gets to decide on the life and death of Palestinians like almost unilaterally? So, but on the issue of intent, abstracting from this particular case, like it happens all the time in history where like one actor, like does one thing thinking that, oh, like this is the situation, like this is the problem space in which these things usually go, and we're gonna act, and then we're gonna parlay, and we're gonna exchange hostages, and then we're gonna go back to things as they were. And maybe the first action goes further than anticipated. Maybe there are consequences that didn't plan, and maybe the reaction on the other side is and suddenly you're no longer in a normal course of events. Suddenly it's a brand new situation, and that's how a lot of revolutions start. There's a series of protests that take place within the accepted frame of how politics is done at a particular place and time, and then there's an event and something snaps or something changes, and suddenly the situation, that's how World War I starts. But it's never.
I was going to say
never
just describing World War I.
Yeah, but like it's never. There's like a decades-long buildup to World War I.
Absolutely.
The material conditions were there. And then there's one event, but it could have been, 5 years earlier. It could have been 5 years later. Right. So in this case, it seems that we should read the conflict as like there's a long-standing 100-year war, or 100 years, or over 100 years, sort of like building conflict with a particular set of material constraints in which Israel has the upper end, or the state of Israel has the upper end on controlling the situation. And then Hamas decides to perform a military action, which it seems maybe they was more successful than they intended, or caught Israel, sort of on the back foot, and then the reaction is completely disproportionate. But that doesn't mean that there was, I don't know. The issue of intent is a complex one, and I don't know enough about this particular conflict to really make a claim about Israel. But what I'm trying to say is that like intent matters to some extent, but often history kind of overwhelms the intent, or like the kind of historical processes at work. Like take the situation even where like the actors involved didn't mean to take it.
And this seems to be the case in the Zanzibar Revolution. which is a case I thought about bringing up in the earlier panel, in part because John Okello, who is the figure who catalyzes the revolution, but was not the figure who was supposed to catalyze the revolution, because the communists had been working very hard for a very long time, and this man shows up. John Okello claimed to be a Mau Mau, and built his reputation and his kind of persuasive capacity in part on that basis. But of course, what happens in the Zanzibar Revolution is John Okello convinces people to go on a coup rampage, and they do, but the aftermath of the political violence in question, which was meant to be a kind of small contained operation, it just kind of bubbles up, and every frustration that had been marking Zanzibari society against Zanzibari elites is redirected towards people who are racialized in ways adjacent to the elites, who had also been in antagonistic class and racial relationships with the majority of the Zanzibari population, but not the exact same ones, nor for the same reasons. And it is often described as an event that had a genocidal character. And this is striking too, because it's not in the common sense, when we use the word genocide, we're thinking about a numbers game. It doesn't feel correct to call something a genocide if it's too small, because something feels inaccurate about it. And the violence in Zanzibar was relatively small in scale compared to what gets called genocides elsewhere. I think it's quite straightforward to think about the kind of catalytic explosions that can take place when violence becomes a social outlet. With that being said, I'm not sure how to read that kind of phenomenon in the crisis right now.
This is a really good conversation, actually. I'm really happy about intent. So I want to address this both sort of in strangely legal thought and then in history and maybe a little bit of philosophy. Often there is this question of intent. And I actually managed to look it up because I used it in the other session as well. The category that is the form of denial that often is this kind of military denial is called oh God, I'm gonna get it out again. Is called interpretive denial. And I love this phrase, right? Interpretive denial is what the US government did, for example, all throughout the war on terror, which honestly still continues, right? Our enemies, I'm speaking now as the US government for some bizarre reason, right? Our enemies intend to murder us. They seek out to murder us. We just are trying to defend ourselves, and it just so happens we're using F-16s to do it. And that tends to level, whole buildings and neighborhoods. So whoops, sorry. I hate to be glib about that, but that is the way in which this kind of intent language has worked in recent military conflict. Ironically, I was also going to cite revolutions, which both Audrey and Illyrio did. So a good example of actual stated, it's actually very rare that you see actual stated genocidal intent. Although frankly, it is in many of the current Israeli government party platforms. They are available in English. Just go look at them. I read Hebrew, but you don't need to read Hebrew to be able to see most of this stuff, actually. So it's actually pretty rare, and I'll give an example of the rarity. I use this in class a lot. It's only a few times in history that you really get that record scratch moment. One of them is the Haitian Revolution, one of them is the Paris Commune, and one of them is the Bolshevik Revolution, and to a degree, the Chinese Revolution as well, where a lot of folks basically just come out. The Haitian Revolution is just so clear because it's also before language was bowdlerized into not saying what you're saying. The Haitian Revolution was just like, hey, Spain, France, everyone's just like, yo, we're going to put our differences aside because that shit is unacceptable. And what we'll do is kill them all. And in fact, this is what Dessalines had to tell his people after Toussaint was taken prisoner, taken captive. He was like, they've actually said this. I'm telling you what they've said. They actually have said they're going to kill you. And if you
Toussaint, who Macron just recently claimed to have been emancipated by the French Republic.
I can't even with that. That's too much. But just to sort of stick with the history example, even someone as directly eliminationist as, say, the Nazis, didn't actually know what form their eliminationism would take until it took form. In fact, many Nazis, Eichmann, very famous because Arendt wrote about it, right? Were like, let's just ship them all to Palestine. That's where some of them want to go anyway. And then others were like, we'll use it for slave labor, right? And others were like, let's just kill them all, right? Like the famous conference, the Wannsee conference, where they talk about it. And they're like, well, what should we actually do now that we've established this legal regime of Jewish restriction? What should we do with Jews? This was like an open question. They didn't actually know what to do now that they had achieved it. And in this case, I think we see a mixture of all of these. I know that some of these comparisons are very difficult for folks. The Bolshevik case is also a very good one, and also because it was explicitly very anti-Semitic. 10 different countries from around the world supported the Black Hundreds, who literally marched around killing Jews and communists because they said these are all the same people anyway. So it's very rare you have a situation like that. The kind of thing we see unfolding right now in Gaza is much more normal. That's why Roz Siegel wrote that excellent piece in Jewish Currents saying this is a textbook case. Why is it a textbook case? Because very rarely do you actually get the statement, we are going to do it. Instead, you get, as Audrey said, sort of uncontrollable situations on the ground, and then you kind of work it out as you go. That said, there has always been, and I cannot stress this enough, from the beginning, this is not a new phenomenon with Bibi or a new phenomenon with Likud. This has been the idea of transferring Palestinians and or killing and or some combination of the two, and certainly wiping out whatever distinctiveness there is about Palestinians, has been both openly declared and sort of unconsciously practiced throughout the history of Israel. So I think in this situation, what we are seeing unfold is, in fact, very improvisational. It's very clear the Israelis were caught by surprise. They don't want the world to see that their security equipment doesn't work. They don't, and I also do think that, from what I can tell, and I'm very cautious because I don't trust Western media, to be perfectly honest. From what I can tell, it also appears Hamas had no idea that they would be so able to, like, not just cross the border, but actually infiltrate and stay in Israel for a few days. It was unthinkable. They just didn't think it was possible. A lot of what I've read about this is that they thought they would take a couple of soldiers and do a prisoner swap, as they did with Gilad Shalit. Am I saying the name wrong? I'm very tired now. Several years ago. Now, do I know that's true? I have no idea. But I do know that this pincer movement that Israel is doing, and its commitment to saying we are going to half the strip, we're going to depopulate it, and these quiet conversations that are apparently having with Egypt, sounds like an improvised genocide in motion. I don't know if anyone else wants to deal with that.
Right. So I guess what you could say is, like, there's like the public has been primed, the material conditions have been sort of assembled.
The facts on the ground. I'll use that euphemism again.
But the specific moment or the specific way in which it's developing in October 2023 in the conditions that we're observing is, kind of accelerating events that nobody really has full control of.
I think that's right.
That said, you can always stop bombing.
Yeah, I mean,
let's not turn this into this kind of like impossible thing to stop.
Right.
Like
the bombing campaign is very, I mean, again, I don't know how much we want to spend on military strategy, but the bombing campaign is very indicative of something. It's indicative of the fact that Israel is insecure in its military capacity right now. It is also facing increased challenges on the northern front, minorly. Hezbollah seems to be doing some stuff, but very little, and in various other places as well. But by and large, when you see this kind of bombing campaign, it means that, and the US does this all the time. So the US is like the king of this. So don't worry, it's not picking on Israel. US is the best at this, right? We'll bomb the shit out of anything. We'll drone strike the shit out of anything. Because in fact, we know we don't have the ground forces to hold it. And I think you see a similar pattern happening in Israel, despite the mobilization being one of the largest in recent history, I think, period, that they are very concerned that they don't actually know the full extent of the military capacity within the Palestinian territories. All right, maybe that's enough on military strategy. I sound like a lunatic.
I do want to add a point on military strategy, which is just that the IDF is a conscript army. Teenagers do not really want to do it anyway, but it's part of their protracted adolescence, and so they do it because it's the law. A change in the social contract that requires them to enter into meaningful military conflict with Hamas would be radically unpopular, which is why it has been avoided, which is why the IDF is sending tanks without infantry support, even though that is something that is not done in warfare. Yeah.
All right, I think we should, oh, sorry, Nafis, please.
Just to the last point, I mean, how do you then equate the fact that the 84% of Israeli population think that there should be, Gaza should essentially be destroyed? And maybe I'm rephrasing a little. There's like massive popular support for the.
Is that to me or to Illyrio?
Oh, to Illyrio, yeah, to the question of if IDF conscription to actually engage Hamas in a meaningful way would be unpopular.
Well, to engage Hamas in an ethical way, because the way to conduct a war non-genocidally is to fight it on equal terms, and Israel can bomb. It has been bombing Gaza, right?
Yes.
So
Nagasaki's.
Right. So it can arm settlers and encourage them to do what they want to do in the West Bank. These are different things than saying your 18-year-old is now going to go themselves into this war zone. Because
that might affect legitimacy.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. I think that is important. And also, I'm glad we brought up the West Bank again, because the in the West Bank, again, I don't know what reports to trust and what reports not to trust, but my understanding is that the Israeli government is officially deputizing settler militias, which is, if you're talking about classic fascism, that's pretty close. And a lot of these folks, I've been there, like I've been to Hebron, right? Like I've had IDF guns pointed at me. I've had Palestinian guns pointed at me. I've had settler guns pointed at me. Then they hear that I talk like this and they're like, oh, how are the Yankees doing? It's a bizarre situation there, and one though that is very enlightening, because you can sort of drown Gaza in the fog of war, but what's happening in the West Bank, there is actually no justification. You can't even pretend it's a Hamas, anti-Hamas action. It's just people continuing ethnic cleansing. It's just people pushing for further transfer. That is just a continuation of the normal. The normalcy is death, the normal way of doing things, the regular state of emergency, if you will. But yeah, I think that covers that, I hope. Mark?
Sort of getting towards the end here, so perhaps one more
Great.
question. And let's see.
Are we talking? Okay, go ahead.
No, I don't want to do anything that's redundant and rehearses previous answers, but sort of maybe final question. What
the
is
piece is back. Sorry. So we can do the water thing or the violence legitimacy thing. I don't know. It's up to you, man.
yeah, sure, let's do water. It's a little bit less controversial. Maybe
I'm sorry, I'm trying to look through this list and I don't know what else I'm seeing. I see one on violence and legitimacy and one on water.
Yeah, can you please elaborate more on the water situation in Gaza and the West Bank, and how the water is controlled exactly? Thank you.
So Nafis, do you want to talk about the cholera and this is really
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think like just a quick jump back to history. It was in 1967 when the Israeli military took over the water resource control in the area, and it didn't get over to civilian control till like 1982. But there's a lot of laws and regulations around it, and the Oslo II Accords in 1995 play a role in how the water is distributed. All of Israel's water comes from two big, I think like three big aquifers, and then there's the Jordan River, right, which empties into the Sea of Galilee. The Jordan River is out of bounds for Palestinians. It's controlled by the Israeli military and only accessible to the Israeli settlers. The groundwater is divided as used to be 60%, 40%, but I think now after the Oslo II Accords, it's 80% Israelis get it and 20% Palestinians, right? So that automatically sets up the part where obviously Israelis enjoy a larger share of the water and Palestinians don't. I think Amnesty International says it's something like Israelis consume 4 times the water that an average Palestinian does. In Gaza, the bigger problem is that even though there is infrastructure, right, because of the continued blockade and the attacks, especially in 2008, 2009, that severely affected, water transport systems or water purification systems, right? There is not like large desalination plants, but they're like small scale ones. And I believe a lot of people use a reverse osmosis filter in their households. But again, because of the continued blockade, parts are hard to come by, right? This treatment is not that great. And occasional, like the continued attacks actually affect the wastewater treatment facilities, right? Because those are targeted as like quote unquote military targets. In the West Bank, the problem is more of like encroaching settlers, right? So what they would do is basically they would, when the settlers are moving into an area, right, and if there is a water source that that a particular Palestinian village uses, the settlers would sort of get water, like essentially steal the water. Like they would drill near there into the same groundwater and then bring it up, right? And they have the tacit and active support of the Israeli military, which makes it easier for them to enforce um, their demand of that water and to like keep it for themselves. So essentially, like over time, as the illegal settlements keep pushing, right, you have more and more loss of water access by Palestinians, which then becomes this problem of um, where you're going to get the water from, right? So you're also by law not allowed to collect rainwater in the West Bank and Gaza.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has part to do with how the aquifers get filled, right? Like a lot of the rainwater goes into the ground. So by extension, if you're collecting the rainwater, then you're
emptying the aquifer.
Yeah. And then you're, I guess like you're not letting the Israelis their proportionate amount of water because they've already taken it preemptively, I suppose you could make that argument. Yeah, so those actually are the more passive controls that are put in place. But I think the Merokot, or Mekorot, I'm sorry, I don't particularly know that very well. It's like the Israeli Water Authority, right?
Sure, yes.
Yeah, they do have total control of the infrastructure, right? So I don't in Gaza. So Hamas is not in charge of the in charge of infrastructure. So that's why they were able to like turn off water supply, right? Because again, it's coming from the aquifers that are under Israeli control at this point, right? So that's what creates a really intangible situation where if you don't have clean water, right, you have waterborne diseases. And I think more recently it was found that people were actually drinking water that was not desalinated. So, and there is, because of also the breakdown in wastewater treatment plants, a lot of the water that's spilling into the Mediterranean is untreated, right? So if you are not treating the water and you're putting it back into the sea and then drinking it again, it just creates the really perfect conditions for microbes or like pathogens to thrive. So you're going to see outbreaks of cholera, probably typhoid, right? And but then generally you can't survive on desalinated, like on
Yeah.
seawater, right? Like nobody can drink seawater and survive like for extended periods of time. So that really is, in a nutshell, what's happening with the water crisis. And it's very intense right now, but the control of water resources, and Ajay was talking about it earlier in the session, is that is also part of like the larger climate crisis, because the lack of fresh water is a problem, not just in that region, like in all over Middle East,
Everywhere.
right? Because of, yeah, so and I think globally too, which essentially has made it into like a futures commodity that is being traded right
Yep.
now.
Water
Right? So
futures.
yeah, and I think a couple of years ago, Cape Town had to start rationing water
That's right.
because of the aridity in the region. So it's a larger problem, but I think it's taken on um, very intense proportions because of the conflict and also because of the blockade and the fact that the Israelis are able to control water flow in that whole region, especially into Gaza and West Bank.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Nafis. That was really informative. So I guess we'll close on this question. And this is us, the Zenobia Mubarak, sorry if I mispronounced it, asks, and this is a moral and controversial question, but I wonder, what is the speaker's opinion on legitimate violence against civilians? And can inhabitants of a secular colonial power be considered as apolitical? I'm referring to the hostages taken by Hamas. If we say that civilians of a settler or colonial society are complicit, what would that imply, for example, for US citizens?
I want to jump into that at its tail end. The United States is not Israel, though it is very good friends. And one of the ways that the United States is not Israel is that there is not an armed indigenous resistance movement in this country. The structure of indigenous demand is on completely different terms. So there's something that is happening in the discursive architecture that is being encouraged by Israel and that's being encouraged by Zionists to invite Americans to feel afraid in the same way that people who have settled close to Gaza feel afraid. That is about imagine yourself in the shoes of someone who is subject to some kind of counterattack. But there are other ways to approach your one settler position in this country. There are indigenous groups activisting. That is not a word. It is late.
Okay.
There are indigenous groups that are organizing in various capacities, and that have been for a very long time, that you can engage with and kind of sidestep this imaginary violence that maybe hypothetically will be done unto you if you fail to do something that you can just start doing now. It feels very much like this should be a priority in how we're thinking. And it also feels like it should be a priority to think about complicity with the violence that is taking place in Israel, rather than this kind of metaphorical complicity to abstract ideas.
Rebecca, you said you had something you wanted to address on this one?
I didn't, but I wonder.
Oh, I thought you said you did. I apologize.
No, but I mean, this question, I wonder if I wonder if the word complicity is all that useful in thinking through political conflict, because it is it's individualist, it's legalistic, it verges on sort of moral responsibility in a way that's incompatible with like any, I think, like useful way of demonstrating solidarity or acting politically, right? And I think embedded in this question of whether or not citizens benefiting from colonial violence, such as the hostages taken by Hamas, are complicit or not, is a sort of, I mean, I think the question is inviting us to place blame on individuals, and I just think it's the wrong question, frankly. So that's what I have to say about that.
I have oh, sorry, Audrey, were you trying to jump in? I have some very direct and then a couple of, yeah, actually mostly just very direct answers to this. I'll entertain the hypothetical just for the moment. I think what Illyrio said is true. It's also kind of tragic in a way, because it speaks to the shattering of parts of Native American resistance here in the United States. But actually, you know, a lot of friends of mine, again, I'll say it a million times, like, right, I grew up in a very Jewish area with lots of Jewish friends, many of whom talk to me all the time, and ask me this exact question. And I'll tell you the exact answer I gave them, which is, especially as someone who, I'm a musician, I played at festivals, I've attended festivals in Texas or near there, right, near the border. If like I forget how many people are in immigrant detention in the United States, hundreds of thousands, millions, God knows, it's huge. If one of these concentration camps, which is what they are, broke out and kidnapped me, I wouldn't be thrilled about it on a moral level. I wouldn't like it, but I'd understand it. And I think this gets to the heart of actually what's blocked when we don't allow analysis, when we just say, it's pure evil, I don't want to think about it. It's pure evil, so I can avoid thinking about it. I can turn my brain off. Because truthfully, yes, if that happened, I would not personally, morally be happy, but I would get it. I'd be like, sure, that makes sense. I get it. And I will also say that, as I said earlier, and you know, it's going to be in print soon enough, so I better start sticking up for it. Like, I do think that political violence is often necessary, not always, but often. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of it, not just in the Middle East, just in period. And I'll use Bolivia as my example again. When the Bolivians, when the MAS party, which is really more of like a party movement, complicated to explain, has many different parts. When they overthrew the fascist coup government, and they were fascists, they're Christian fascists who with our support, took over the Bolivian government, people were killed. They didn't, again, this gets to intent, this gets to all these things, but people were innocent people were killed. The anti-fascist movement apologized for it, but it's a fact, it happened. And some were killed accidentally, and some were killed on purpose, right? Some were killed by sniper fire, some were killed because of traffic jams, because that's what happens when there's mass protests. So to me, this question is really interesting in many ways, because complicity, yeah, I don't know about that. Again, it brings me back to what Tony was teaching about Fanon before, which is that violence is a fact. Like, ongoing violence in different kinds of colonial situations in particular, it's just fact, it's just there. It's what we then do with it that is actually what matters. And, you know, that's the sort of hopeful side of Fanon that no one really talks about that often, right? Where at the end, he's like, you know, maybe both the like Algerian and the Frenchman can like not be complete psychotic messes, because in fact, that's what the conflict produced. but also he knows he can't get there until there is a political solution on the ground. And there is no political solution on the ground right now. And very few, certainly within Israel, are working for it. And so the last part I would add to this is I think going back 2 questions or 2 comments ago, the Israeli left is very marginal. There are some Israeli leftists who are very committed to Palestinian liberation. They are almost completely gone, though. Not gone, that's the wrong word. They are largely silenced, and they are completely, increasingly sidelined within Israeli society. I think many people were very hopeful that the kind of protests people saw against the Netanyahu government was this kind of opening up of the Israeli public sphere, to bring us back to our old chap Habermas, right? But in fact, when people tried to bring Palestinian solidarity and Palestinian issues into those spaces, they were roundly rejected. And in fact, now we see the principal opposition party in Israel holding almost the exact same positions as the current government. So it really is very much a situation in which there is politically, again, not morally or personally, politically, that is where the situation lies. And I think the question, and unfortunately, we're running out of time. I don't want to take up all of it because we're past our end point here. The question is what we can do, right? There are actions. I know they may sound feeble and incomplete, but there's protests being planned. There's phone banking that's happening, and I hope it escalates. I do hope that. I hope it escalates into, as Nafis was talking about, blocking ports. I hope, as we've seen, people trying to block and protest the functioning of Israeli arms corporations. This kind of thing, you can do this. Like, it's possible. There are groups out there. Connect with them. You like, God, everything I want to say sounds so cliche. Like, this is happening, right? Like, never again is right now. Like, and it, like, you want to do what you can for the love of God.
I just wanted to say that what you said initially really sort of clarified what I think I was trying to get to, not very successfully, that like this, that the word complicity is, it elides this political understanding. And so to say that I'm not complicit, that's, and I don't think it's actually useful for people to try to figure out whether they're guilty or not, right? Which is different than saying that I am, like, in many senses, the expression of some sort of structural inequality, right? And that I am the beneficiary of structural inequalities. But I think that difference between, I deserve to be kidnapped and I understand why I'm being kidnapped is really, and it's like a really tiny point, but I think it's really important because I do think that one of the things that happens in these moments is a real confusion between politics and morality. And Americans seem particularly subject to this like tendency to engage in what is essentially just like performative bourgeois sanctimony, right? And it's not politics, and it's not a clear way to think about things, right? It's actually just like white people thinking about themselves.
I do want to make the smallest, tiniest defense of this terrible word complicity. And the defense I want to make of it is that it is an entry point to realizing you are in the political world. Thinking of yourself as complicit because your tax money is going to Israel is the entry point to thinking about this kind of balance sheet of benefits that accrue to you for just the happening of where you were born and where you happen to be living, and that maybe can be pulled into some direction where you're taken more seriously. But if you don't even have that, if you don't even have the sense, the other thing that's useful about complicity is if you feel complicit, you feel bad, which is a signal that your alignments are with something else, which is something that can be worked with. And if you don't feel complicit, there's not political community to be built there. So I think, yeah, I think there's something to be patient with this frustrating term.
I almost wish Abby and Pat were here because they could tell us what our feelings actually mean. I think that brings us to a close, Mark. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a good point to end on. Good place to end. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today throughout the day. To our faculty, guests, panelists, thank you so much. And thank you to the audience for joining us today and being involved and participating. And I hope you found it helpful. So thanks very much, and we'll sign off.